Kyle Martinez stared at his ceiling and counted the cracks in the paint for the 100th time that week, because sleep would not come no matter how hard he tried, and his brain kept reminding him about all the things that were going wrong in his life, like the overdue rent and the car that needed fixing and the job interview tomorrow that he absolutely could not mess up, because he really needed this position at the tech company downtown. He rolled over and checked his phone and saw it was 2 in the morning, and he groaned because he needed to be up in 4 hours and looking presentable and confident, which was going to be impossible if he spent the whole night worrying about everything. But then something happened that made him forget about all his problems in the strangest way possible. There was a light coming through his bedroom window, and at first Kyle thought maybe it was just a car passing by, or maybe his neighbor had turned on their porch light, but this light was different because it was blue and soft, and it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. And when he sat up in bed to get a better look, he saw something that made his mouth fall open. In shock, standing right there in the middle of his bedroom was a girl, but not just any girl, because she was clearly not from Earth, and she looked absolutely terrified. As she glanced around his room, taking in the messy clothes on the floor and the posters on the walls and the old computer desk in the corner. She was tall and slender, with skin that had a pale purple tone like the color of lavender flowers, and her hair was long and silver, and it seemed to shimmer even in the dim light from his window, and her ears were pointed and stuck out from her hair in a way that reminded him of the elves from fantasy movies, but what really caught his attention were her eyes. Her eyes were huge and golden like honey in sunlight, and right now they were wide with fear and panic, and she was breathing fast like she had just run a marathon, and her hands were trembling as she looked down at some kind of device on her wrist that was flashing red and making small beeping sounds. Kyle did not know what to do, because having an alien appear in your bedroom was not something they taught you how to handle in school. And for a moment he just sat there frozen in his bed with his blanket pulled up to his chest, like that would somehow protect him from whatever was happening. The girl noticed him then, and she made a small sound that was half gasp and half squeak, and she immediately tried to hide behind his desk chair, which was completely ridiculous because the chair was way too small, and she was way too tall, and Kyle could still see most of her body sticking out from behind it. He slowly raised both hands in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture, and he tried to keep his voice calm and steady, even though his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest, and he said, "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." The girl peeked out from behind the chair, and those golden eyes studied him carefully, like she was trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. And Kyle noticed that she was wearing clothes that looked like they were made from some kind of fabric that changed colors when she moved, shifting from deep blue to purple to silver. She said something in a language that Kyle had never heard before, and it sounded beautiful, like wind chimes mixed with music and running water all at once, but he had no idea what any of it meant, and he shook his head and said, "I don't understand." And she looked frustrated and scared and maybe a little bit like she might cry. Then she touched the device on her wrist and pressed a few buttons, and suddenly she was speaking English, though her voice had a strange musical accent that made every word sound like part of a song. And she said, "Please do not alert your planetary authorities. I did not intend to transport to this location. My vessel experienced a critical malfunction." Kyle blinked and tried to process what she had just said, because apparently she had a spaceship or something, and it had broken down, and she had ended up in his apartment by complete accident, and he asked, "Are you okay? Are you hurt anywhere?" And she shook her head and stepped out a little bit from behind the chair. She was still shaking, and Kyle could see now that she looked exhausted and scared and completely lost, and he felt something shift in his chest because he knew exactly what it felt like to be alone and frightened and not know what to do next. And he said, "You can sit down if you want," and he pointed to his bed. The girl looked at his bed like she was not sure what it was for. And then very carefully and slowly she walked over and sat down on the very edge of it with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. And Kyle noticed that even though she was clearly terrified, she moved with a kind of grace that reminded him of dancers or royalty. He cleared his throat and said, "I'm Kyle," and she looked at him and said, "My name is Lyria, and I am from the planet Velthara." And Kyle thought that was a beautiful name for a beautiful girl. And then he felt embarrassed for thinking that because she was an alien who had just crash-landed in his bedroom, and this was definitely not the time for those kinds of thoughts. Lyria took a deep breath and said, "I was attempting to escape an arranged union on my homeworld and my vessel malfunctioned during the jump and now I do not know where my ship landed, and I cannot return until I locate it and repair the navigation systems. And Kyle realized that this girl was running away from something and she was stuck here with no way home. Kyle looked at Lyria sitting on his bed looking lost and scared, and he made a decision that was probably crazy, but felt right in his gut, and he said, "You can stay here while you figure things out." And Lyria's golden eyes went wide with surprise, and she asked, "Why would you offer this? I am a stranger from another world." He shrugged and said, "Because you need help, and I can't exactly let you wander around the city looking like that, because people would definitely notice and probably call the government or something." And Lyria looked down at herself and then back at him and asked, "What is wrong with my appearance?" Kyle realized he might have offended her, and he quickly said, No, you look great. I mean, you look beautiful. It's just that humans don't have purple skin or pointed ears or, golden eyes." And Lyria blushed this deep purple color that spread across her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands and said, "I understand I am different here." He felt bad for making her self-conscious and said, "Hey, different isn't bad, it's just noticeable, and we need to keep you hidden until we figure out how to find your ship and fix it." And Lyria nodded slowly and said, "I appreciate your kindness, Kyle Martinez, and I will try not to be a burden." And Kyle said, "It's just Kyle, and you won't be a burden." The next morning, Kyle woke up, and for a moment he thought the whole thing had been a weird dream. But then he heard soft sounds coming from his kitchen, and he got up and walked out, to find Lyria standing in front of his refrigerator with the door open, staring at all the food inside like it was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. She turned when she heard him and immediately looked embarrassed and said, "I apologize, I was hungry and I did not wish to wake you, but I do not understand how this cold storage unit operates." And Kyle tried not to laugh because she looked so serious and confused. And he said, "It's okay. Let me make us some breakfast." He pulled out eggs and bread and started cooking, while Lyria watched him with fascination, and she asked so many questions about everything, like, "Why do you heat the food? And what are these white oval things, and how does the fire come from this flat surface?" And Kyle answered all her questions as best he could while trying not to burn the eggs. When he set a plate in front of her, Lyria stared at it for a long moment, and then very carefully picked up the fork and tried the eggs, and her eyes lit up, and she said, "This is delicious. On my world we consume mostly synthesized nutrition packets, and this has so much more flavor." And Kyle felt proud even though he had just made basic scrambled eggs. After breakfast, Kyle had to get ready for his job interview, and he told Lyria she needed to stay inside and not answer the door if anyone knocked, and she nodded seriously and said, "I understand, I will remain hidden." And Kyle grabbed his jacket and headed out, hoping that everything would be okay. The interview went better than expected, and Kyle actually felt good about his chances as he drove home. But when he walked through his apartment door, he found Lyria sitting on his couch watching his television with the remote in her hand, and she was completely absorbed in some nature documentary about dolphins. She looked up when he came in, and her face broke into a smile that made his chest feel warm, and she said, "Kyle, you have returned. How did your meeting go?" And he told her about the interview, and she listened carefully and said, "I hope you receive this position. You speak of it with such hope in your voice." Kyle asked what she had been doing all day, and Lyria gestured to the television and said, "I have been learning about your world through this viewing screen, and it is fascinating. Your planet has such diverse life forms," and she started telling him all these facts about ocean creatures, and Kyle realized she had been watching educational programs all day. Over the next few days, they fell into a strange but comfortable routine where Kyle would go to work and Lyria would stay home learning about Earth. And when he came back, she would be waiting with that shy smile, and she would ask him about his day and tell him what she had learned, and Kyle found himself hurrying home each evening just to see her. Lyria was the most considerate person he had ever met, and she always tried to help, even though she did not understand how most things worked. And one day he came home to find that she had attempted to do his laundry but had somehow turned all his white shirts pink because she did not know you had to separate colors. She looked so upset and apologetic and said, "I have ruined your garments. I am sorry, I was trying to be helpful." And Kyle laughed and said, "It's okay, they are just shirts." And Lyria looked relieved and gave him that smile again, and he thought pink shirts were a small price to pay for that smile. At night they would sit on the couch and watch movies, And Lyria would ask questions about human culture and customs and why people did certain things. And Kyle would try to explain even though sometimes he did not really know the answers himself. And Lyria seemed to find everything about Earth both confusing and wonderful. She told him stories about her planet too, about the crystal cities and the 3 moons and the gardens that grew flowers which sang at dawn. And Kyle listened and thought her world sounded beautiful, but also cold and formal, and he understood why she had run away from the arranged marriage one evening. Lyria was looking at the device on her wrist, and she said, "I have been scanning for my vessel, but the signal is very weak. I believe it landed somewhere within 50 miles of this location, but I cannot determine the exact coordinates," and Kyle said, "We will find it, don't worry." But privately, Kyle was not sure he wanted to find her ship, because that would mean Lyria would leave and go back to her world. And even though he had only known her for a few days, he could not imagine his apartment without her anymore, and that scared him because he barely knew her. But somehow she had become important to him. On the 7th day of Lyria staying at his apartment, Kyle got a call saying he had gotten the job, and he was so excited that he rushed home early to tell her. And when he burst through the door, Lyria jumped up from the couch looking startled and worried until she saw his smile. And then she smiled too. He told her the good news, and Lyria clapped her hands together and said, "This is wonderful, Kyle. I am very happy for you." And then she did something unexpected and hugged him, and Kyle froze for a second because she was warm and she smelled like something sweet and flowery, and his heart started beating faster. When she pulled back, she looked embarrassed and said, "I apologize on my world. We do not engage in such physical contact outside a family." And Kyle said, "It's okay. Humans hug all the time," and Lyria nodded, but her cheeks were that deep purple color again. To celebrate, Kyle ordered pizza. And Lyria had never had pizza before. And when she took her first bite, her eyes went wide, and she said, "How do your people create such amazing food? This combination of flavors is incredible." And Kyle laughed and said, "Wait until you try ice cream." That night they stayed up late talking, and Lyria told him more about her life on Velthara, and how she had grown up in the royal palace and been trained to be a perfect princess, and how every day was scheduled and planned, and she never had any freedom to choose what she wanted to do or who she wanted to be. She said the arranged marriage was the final thing that made her decide to leave, because the man they wanted her to marry was cold and cared only about political power, and she could not imagine spending her life with someone who did not care about her as a person. Kyle told her about his life too, about how his parents had died when he was young and how he had been working hard just to survive and pay his bills, and how sometimes he felt like he was stuck in a life that was not really his. And Lyria listened and said, "We are not so different, you and I, both seeking something more than what we were given." Something shifted between them that night, and Kyle realized he was falling for this shy alien princess who had accidentally crashed into his life, and the thought terrified him because she was literally from another world, and eventually she would have to leave. The next week, Kyle started his new job, and it was busy and demanding, but he liked the work, and his coworkers were friendly, and every day he would text Lyria during his lunch break, and she would tell him what she was doing and send him pictures of things she found interesting, like a bird outside the window or the sunset. One day he came home to find Lyria sitting on the floor surrounded by all his books, and she looked up at him with excitement in her golden eyes and said, "Kyle, your world has such rich history and so many different cultures. I have been reading about them all day." And Kyle sat down next to her and they talked about history and culture until midnight. Lyria was becoming braver about being in the apartment, and she no longer hid. When she heard noises in the hallway, and she had learned how to use most of the appliances, though she still thought the microwave was magic, and Kyle had stopped trying to explain how it actually worked. But there was a problem, because Lyria's device kept beeping and flashing, and she explained that it was tracking her ship and the signal was getting stronger, which meant they were getting close to finding it, and Kyle should have been happy, but instead he felt sad. One Saturday, Kyle suggested they go look for her ship, and Lyria agreed, and they got in his car and followed the signal on her device, and they drove out of the city into the countryside, and the signal got stronger and stronger until they reached a wooded area near a small lake. They hiked into the woods, and there it was hidden under some trees and covered with branches and leaves, and Lyria's ship looked like nothing Kyle had ever seen before. It was silver and sleek and shaped like a teardrop, and it seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Lyria ran to it and touched the hull, and a door opened and she climbed inside, and Kyle followed her, and the inside was amazing with glowing panels and strange symbols and a chair that looked like it was made of liquid metal. She sat down and started pressing buttons and checking systems, and her face fell, and she said the damage is worse than I thought it will. Take weeks to repair, maybe months. And Kyle tried to hide his relief because that meant she would be staying longer. They drove back to the apartment in silence, and Lyria seemed sad, and Kyle finally asked what is wrong. And she said, I have been running away for so long, but now that I am here, I do not know if I want to go back. And Kyle's heart jumped and he said, What do you mean? Lyria looked at him and said, On Velthara, I was never happy. I was always performing, always being who others wanted me to be, but here with you, I feel like I can be myself. And Kyle pulled the car over because this felt like an important conversation that should not happen while driving. He turned to her and said, You can stay as long as you want, and Lyria said, But eventually they will come looking for me. My family will send ships to search, and if they find me here, they will take me back, and they might harm you for harboring me. Kyle said, Then we will figure it out together. We will find a way. And Lyria looked at him with tears in her golden eyes and said, Why are you being so kind to me, Kyle Martinez? You barely know me. And Kyle took a breath and said, Because I care about you and I want you to be happy. Lyria reached over and took his hand, and her skin was warm and soft, and she said, I care about you too. And that scares me because I have never felt this way before. And Kyle understood because he had never felt this way before either. After their conversation in the car, things changed between Kyle and Lyria in small but meaningful ways, like how they would sit closer on the couch during movies, or how Lyria would touch his arm when she was excited about something, or how Kyle would bring her flowers from the store because he learned she loved earth flowers. Lyria started going out with Kyle sometimes, and they bought her sunglasses and a hat to hide her pointed ears, and she wore gloves to cover the purple tint of her hands, and as long as people did not look too closely, she could pass for human, though Kyle thought she was far more beautiful than any human. They went to the park, and Lyria was amazed by the ducks and the children playing, and she said on Velthara, Everything is so controlled and orderly. There is no room for spontaneous joy like this. And Kyle watched her face light up with wonder, and he fell a little more in love with her. One evening they were cooking dinner together, and Lyria was trying to learn how to make pasta, and she kept getting the noodles tangled and laughing at herself, and Kyle was helping her, and their hands touched, and they both froze and looked at each other. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of boiling water, and Lyria said, Kyle, I need to tell you something. And Kyle said, What is it? And she took a breath and said, I have been thinking about my situation, and I realize I do not want to repair my ship. Kyle felt his heart skip, and he asked, What do you mean? And Lyria said, If I repair it, I will have to make a choice to either go back to Velthara or to run again to another world. But I do not want either of those options. I want to stay here with you. He stared at her and said, But your family, they will come looking for you. And Lyria nodded and said, Yes, eventually, but perhaps by then I will have found a way to convince them that I should be allowed to choose my own path. Or perhaps I will have to accept that I can never return. Home, Kyle asked, Are you sure about this? And Lyria smiled and said, I am more sure about this than I have been about anything in my life. And then she leaned forward and kissed him, and it was soft and sweet, and Kyle forgot how to breathe. When they pulled apart, Lyria was blushing that deep purple again, and she said, On my world, that was very forward of me. And Kyle laughed and said, On my world, that was perfect, and he kissed her again. The next few weeks were the happiest of Kyle's life, and he and Lyria fell into a rhythm of domesticity that felt natural and right. And Lyria learned more about Earth culture, and she got better at cooking, and she even started learning how to drive, though Kyle was not sure the world was ready for that. She told him more about Velthara and the customs there, and Kyle learned that Lyria was not just any princess. She was third in line for the throne, which made her situation even more complicated. And he asked if she ever missed her home, and she said, I miss some things, but I do not miss who I was there. One night Lyria was looking at her device, and she suddenly went very still, and Kyle asked, What is wrong? And she said, There is a ship in orbit around your planet, and it is using Velthari technology. And Kyle felt his stomach drop and he asked, "Is it your family?" Lyria checked the readings and nodded and said, "It is a small scout ship probably sent to search for me." And Kyle asked, "How long until they find you?" And Lyria said, "Perhaps a few days. They will scan the planet and eventually detect my biosignature." Kyle felt panic rising in his chest because he had known this might happen, but he was not ready for it. And he asked, "What do we do?" And Lyria looked at him with those golden eyes and said, "We have 3 options. I can turn myself in and return with them. I can run and hide somewhere else on your planet, or I can stay and face them." He asked, "What do you want to do?" And Lyria said, "I want to stay and fight for my right to choose my own life, but that means putting you in danger because they will want to know who has been sheltering me. And there may be consequences." Kyle took her hands and said, "I don't care about the danger, I care about you. And if you want to stay, then we will make it work. Somehow." And Lyria smiled, but her eyes were sad, and she said, "You are a brave man." Kyle Martinez braver than most of the warriors on my world? They spent the next 2 days preparing, and Lyria explained that her people valued honor and directness, so the best approach would be to meet them openly and explain the situation and hope they would understand, though she admitted the chances were not great. On the 3rd day, Lyria's device started beeping urgently, and she said, "They have located me. They are sending a shuttle to this location," and Kyle asked how long, and she said 10 minutes, maybe less. They went outside and waited, and Kyle held Lyria's hand, and she was trembling slightly, and he squeezed her hand and said, "Whatever happens, we are in this together," and she looked at him with love in her eyes and said, "Thank you for giving me a reason to be brave." The shuttle appeared in the sky like a silver dart, and it landed in the street outside Kyle's apartment building with a soft humming sound. And people started coming out of their houses to look, and Kyle knew this was going to be complicated. The shuttle door opened, and 3 figures stepped out, and they were tall and elegant like Lyria, with the same purple-tinted skin and pointed ears, and they wore some kind of uniform that looked both official and ornate. The leader was a woman who looked older than Lyria, and she had the same silver hair, but it was shorter, and her face was stern, and she looked at Lyria and said, "Princess, Lyria, you have caused great concern. Your family has been searching for you." Lyria stepped forward and said, "Commander Thera, I understand, and I apologize for the worry, but I will not return to Velthara." And the commander looked shocked and said, "You cannot refuse. This is your duty." And Lyria said, "My duty is to myself first, and my happiness matters." The commander noticed Kyle then, and she asked, "Who is this human, and why does he stand so close to you?" And Lyria took Kyle's hand and said, "This is Kyle Martinez, and he has shown me what it means to be free and to choose your own path, and I love him." Commander Thera looked like someone had just slapped her, and she stared at Lyria, and then at Kyle, and then back at Lyria, and she said, "Princess, you cannot be serious. You would give up your title, your family, your entire world for a human. You barely." No, Lyria lifted her chin and said, "I have known Kyle for only a few weeks, but in that time, I have learned more about myself and what I want from life than I did in 20 years on Velthara. And yes, I would give up everything for the chance to be happy." One of the other officers stepped forward and said, "Princess, your family loves you. They only want what is best for you." And Lyria said, "Then they should want me to be happy and not force me into a marriage with someone I do not love, Commander." Thera looked at Kyle and said, "Human, do you understand what you are asking this woman to sacrifice? She is royalty. She has responsibilities." And Kyle said, "With all due respect, Commander, those responsibilities were put on her without her consent, and everyone deserves the right to choose their own life." The commander seemed taken aback by his words, and she said, "You speak boldly for someone who harbors a fugitive princess." And Kyle said, "I am not harboring anyone. Lyria is here because she wants to be, and she is free to leave whenever she chooses." Lyria squeezed his hand and said, "I choose to stay." And the commander shook her head and said, "This is not a simple matter. The council will not accept this. Your betrothed is demanding your return. There are political implications," Lyria said. "Then let me speak to the council. Let me make my case." And Commander Thera said, "That is not possible. You must return with us now." And Lyria said, "No." The tension in the air was thick, and Kyle could see the other 2 officers reaching for something at their belts, and he stepped in front of Lyria and said, "You are not taking her anywhere against her will, Commander." Thera raised her hand, and the officers stopped, and she looked at Kyle with something like respect in her eyes, and she said, "You would fight us to protect her." And Kyle said, "I would do whatever it takes." The commander was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I cannot return without the princess. But perhaps there is another way." And Lyria asked, "What do you mean?" Thera said, "I could report that you were not found, that the trail went cold, and that would buy you time, perhaps a few months before they send another search party. And in that time you could prepare your case or make other arrangements." Lyria looked shocked and said, "Why would you do that?" And the commander smiled slightly and said, "Because I was young once, and I too loved someone I could not have, and I made the practical choice and married for duty, and I have regretted it every day since." She looked at Kyle and said, "Take care of her, human, and if you hurt her, I will personally return and make you regret it." And Kyle said, "I promise I will protect her with everything I have." The commander nodded and turned to the other officers and said, "The princess is not here. We will continue the search elsewhere." And the officers looked confused, but they followed orders and they all went back to the shuttle. Before she left, Commander Thera turned back and said, "Princess Lyria, you have a few months at most, use them wisely." And Lyria said, "Thank you, Thera. I will never forget this kindness." The shuttle lifted off and disappeared into the sky, and Kyle and Lyria stood there surrounded by confused neighbors who had watched the whole thing, and they were definitely going to have to move soon because there was no way to explain what had just happened. They went back inside the apartment, and Lyria sat down on the couch and started crying, and Kyle sat next to her and held her and asked, "What is wrong?" And she said, "I am happy, but I am also sad because I have lost my home and my family." Kyle said, "You have not lost them forever. Maybe in time they will understand and accept your choice." And Lyria said, "Maybe. But it will take time and patience, and I do not know if they will ever truly forgive me." He wiped her tears and said, "Then we will face it together one day at a time." And Lyria smiled through her tears and said, "How did I get so lucky to land in your room?" And Kyle laughed and said, "I asked myself the same thing over the next few weeks." They made plans, and Kyle talked to his boss and managed to get transferred to a different city where nobody knew them, and they found a small house on the edge of town where Lyria could be herself without constantly hiding. Lyria started learning more about Earth, and she became fascinated with human art and music, and she even started painting, and her paintings were beautiful and strange and full of colors that seemed to glow. Kyle watched her bloom into someone confident and happy, and he realized that this was who she was always meant to be. Not the shy, scared princess who had appeared in his room, but this strong, brave woman who had chosen her own path one evening. They were sitting on the porch of their new house watching the sunset, and Lyria said, "Kyle, do you ever regret letting me stay?" And Kyle looked at her like she was crazy and said, "Never, not for a single second." She smiled and said, "Good, because I have something to tell you." And Kyle felt nervous and asked, "What is it?" And Lyria said, "I have been in contact with my younger sister secretly, and she has been advocating for me with the council." Kyle asked, "What does that mean?" And Lyria said, "It means there is a chance that eventually my family may accept my choice and allow me to remain here without fear of being forced to return." He felt hope rise in his chest and asked, "Really?" And Lyria said, "It is not certain, but my sister is persuasive, and she believes that times are changing on Velthera, and that perhaps the old ways of arranged marriages and forced duty are coming to an end." Kyle pulled her close and said, "Whatever happens, we will face it together." And Lyria said, "I know, and that is why I am not afraid anymore, because I have you." They sat there as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. And Kyle thought about how his life had completely changed in just a few months, and how this shy alien princess had accidentally stumbled into his room and into his heart. Lyria leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "Kyle Martinez, I love you." And Kyle said, "I love you too, Lyria." And they sat there together, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side because they had found something rare and precious in each other. The future was uncertain, and there would be difficulties and obstacles. But for now, they had this moment and this love and this choice they had both made to be together, and that was enough.